Shalom, friends, and welcome to the first lesson in Yackov. It's exciting, and let's get right to it. We are going to be learning from the tractate of Berachot, the first tractate in the Talmud of blessings, and we're going to start on page 3b in the art scroll that I'm learning with. It is, even though you see it backwards, it is page 17. So the point of the class today is going to be, we are going to reconcile two verses in Psalms, one in Psalm 119 and one in Psalm 147, that seemingly contradict, and we are going to reconcile. We're going to show how they don't contradict. That's the point of today's class. So let's get right to it. The Gemara brings the first verse. It's written in King David says in Psalm 119 verse 62, King David says, "At midnight I arise to give thanks to you." He said, in other words, what's my schedule? What do I do every day at midnight? I wake up, I arise to give thanks to you, Hashem. So the Gemara asks a question, but did David really wake up at midnight? That's when he woke up, at midnight. He was already awake from the early evening. David's schedule was that he was awake already from the early evening. And how do we know that? Because it's written somewhere else, and that's the second verse, the verse one, in Psalm 147, that King David says, I arose at Neshef. And Neshef, the Gemara will show how it means the early evening. So I arose at Neshef and I cried out to him. I cried out to Hashem. So we see that King David was always already awake from the early evening, from Neshef. So how come he says in Psalm 119 that he woke up at midnight? That was his normal schedule, that he woke up at midnight to give thanks to Hashem. How do we reconcile these two verses? So after showing, so the Gemara will give three answers, and the three answers are as follows. The first answer is of Rav Oishia. Rav Oishia says that usually, King David he woke up in the early evening. He probably took an afternoon nap. He was up the whole night. He was up early. He probably took an afternoon nap and then woke up in the early evening, and that's it. Started his day. And that was his normal schedule. And that's what he said in the verse that in 147, that I arose at Neshef in the early evening and I cried out to Hashem. But King David tells us in the verse 119 that even at times when I didn't wake up in the early evening, I kept on sleeping, but I never slept later than midnight. In other words, I was never asleep at midnight. That was the latest I woke up. Midnight never passed me while I was asleep. Okay, so that's the first answer. Rab Zera says, how do we reconcile the two verses? As follows. He says, again, the first answer was that usually King David would wake up in the early evening. Sometimes he slept in a little bit, but he never slept past midnight. Rab Zera says no. King David never slept more, but only up to midnight. He always was up in the early evening. He's a king. It's his schedule. Schedule is a schedule. However, there was a difference in his state of before midnight than after midnight. Before midnight, he would doze off, often like a horse. The Gemara says, a horse. It's known that a horse never falls asleep in a deep sleep. Rather, it's constantly dozing off for short periods, and then it wakes up again. So the same thing also, King David would learn Torah, but he would doze off for short times, and then he would keep on waking up and continue learning, and then dozing off again. But that was up to midnight. Once midnight came, and that's what he meant. Then at midnight he would rise. He would rise up to give thanks to Hashem. What do you mean he would rise? He would strengthen himself like a lion to be fully awake. He took a coffee. Whatever he did, however he did it. He would strengthen himself like a lion to be fully awake. So that's how we reconcile the two things. Again, he never slept more till midnight. He always was up in the early evening. But he was dozing off. But once it came midnight, he strengthened himself like a lion to be fully awake. By the way, I didn't mention earlier, why did King David wake up at midnight? Which is also a customary thing with many people, wake up at midnight and say psalms and mourn the exile of the Shekhinah. They mourn the exile of the Jewish people, the destruction of the Holy Temple. And the reason is because it's brought somewhere else in the Talmud that midnight it's a time of special divine favor, and therefore it's a time that is good to say psalms. And that's why King David did that also. Okay, so that's two answers we have to reconcile the seemingly contradiction between the two verses. A third way is of Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, what, you're telling me that King David was up but he was not fully awake? King David, again, he's like a king. Okay, this is what I'm adding, but whatever. So, no, King David was already fully awake in the evening. But until midnight, what was he involved in? He was involved in studying Torah. Okay? And then, once it came midnight, then he would arise, not from bed. He would arise, he would get up from studying Torah, and then he would involve himself in singing songs and praises to Hashem. That's what he means. That at midnight I arise to give thanks to Hashem, meaning I got up from my Torah study and I involved myself in singing songs and praises to Hashem. But he was always fully awake. Once he got up in the early evening, he was fully awake all the time. That's the three answers how we reconcile the two seemingly contradictory verses in Psalms. Next lesson, we're going to go into a point from what the verse said, that King David said that he woke up at midnight to give thanks to Hashem. So he says at midnight. He doesn't say around midnight I would get up to give thanks to Hashem. At midnight. Meaning he knew the exact time, it was exactly midnight. And that's what the Gemara is going to go into, how exactly the Gemara is going to go into this point. So we'll see that in next class.